Hello everyone, welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version. I usually do a Spanish radio show, but we're giving it a try right now. And on the other end of the line is Robert Orlando. He's a filmmaker and also an accomplished author. Robert is the director of the film A Polite Bribe and also a book by the name Apostle Paul, A Polite Bribe. Hi Robert, welcome.
Hi, how are you? I've got actually, coincidentally, my book just came out yesterday, and I was mailed my first copy, so it's a proud day for me.
All right, congratulations. Okay, so what's the book about? Tell us the main storyline.
What the premise does is it using the critical scholarship that's been amassed over the last few hundred years, it takes a very insightful look at Paul's collection in the New Testament, supported by the Book of Acts and by the New Testament and by Paul's letters, and basically takes the facts we know about the collection and sequences them into a narrative to understand the relationship between Paul and Jesus' first apostles, like his brother James, Peter, John, and the others, and also uses this metaphor of the collection to also show the conflict between the two and how it was ultimately resolved or not resolved.
What was this conflict about?
Well, what few people know, and hope more will know as time goes on with my book and otherwise my film, is that along with other theological considerations that are more what traditional Christians view, just like any other conflict with a movement, there were economical considerations, there were ethnic considerations, other things that stood in the way of Christianity progressing in the way any movement would. In particular, with the case of Paul, it was more ethnicity because the original founders of Christianity or followers of Jesus were Jewish, and Jesus himself was Jewish, and for a lot of critical scholars, always remained and wanted to be a Reformed Jew and nothing more or less. We look now through a screen of years of hundreds of years of theology that kind of restated Jesus in terms that may not be as accurate to his original writings, like with Paul and others. And I think when you look at it through this lens, you realize that what Paul is contending with is not so much an understanding of Messiah, but understanding as to whom would that Messiah reach out to? Would it be more of the Jews alone, or would it be Gentiles also?
If Jesus was so clear that the Gentiles were dogs and that he was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel and so on, where did Paul get this idea from?
No, it's a great question. Well, I would say if you look into, even today, if you look at the collection of the Gospels, almost any thinking Christian or Bible reader is going to say that it's a collection of various traditions that are being put together to form the Gospels. The question becomes, which Jesus emerges the strongest? Is it the sage Jesus who speaks beatitudes and wisdom? Is it the ethnic Jesus who says it's for the Jews and the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Or is it the revolutionary Jesus who wants to overturn the powers of the Sadducees who are in bed with the Roman Empire? I have to say, for me, one thing that comes through very clearly is that while Jesus is showing preference or kindness to the Gentiles, I don't think he ever says clearly that his job was to obliterate or move beyond the Jewish people as the core representatives of his faith. I don't think that's anywhere in the Bible.
Right, but then I wonder, where did Paul get that idea of extending the message to the Gentiles?
I think you could read some of it out of the Old Testament, because in the prophecies sometimes they would say that in the last days, when God would show his grace on the Jews as a final gesture to all mankind, that the gates would open and Gentiles would also come in. The question or the conflict with Paul was this time and Jesus that moment. So I think the conflict is a bit more subtle, but I think the conflict is, for Paul, it was now, let's do it now. Sell everything you have, let's get ready because Jesus is coming back. For them, I think they became more skeptical of Paul's message, and as they waited and Jesus didn't come back, I think they started to question, was this truly the last days, the end times? And if it wasn't, think about what Paul is jeopardizing for the Jews. He's telling them that literally, eradicate your religion. What if Jesus doesn't come back? They would have eradicated the whole Jewish religion, or most of it, or diluted it so much with other ideas that the fear was there'd be nothing left, and therefore Paul was a real threat, and that's how I think it plays out in the Bible.
So would you say that James and the Jerusalem group had some doubts that they were actually living the end times? I mean, because if they were so sure, they would have accepted Paul's message. Now, the fact that they didn't accept Paul's message seems to me some indication that they didn't think that this was really the end, and maybe Jesus was wrong.
Yeah, no, I've said this so many times. I think that key into this conversation is probably the best skeleton key of all. What if there's so much conflict between Paul and the original followers? Where is this conflict coming from? If it's not ethnic, which is what I'm proposing it is, they don't understand the ethnic groups, or they don't see the ethnic groups the same in standing to Christ or God, then I say, where is all the conflict come from? What else are they fighting about? Well, if it's not ethnic, then they must be fighting about basic beliefs. How does James exist in the temple and Paul doesn't exist in the temple? Why would James, who agrees with Paul, have a problem with him bringing a collection for the Gentiles? Where is all this? So I don't think we really know the true story of the other. People would say reading Paul is like listening to one side of a telephone call. You don't hear what the other side is saying, so you assume they're wrong and Paul is right. But probably as we put the pieces back together historically of Jewish Christianity, you'd see that there's a counter-argument, just like you'd see and read in the Pauline letters from the Greco-Roman world, that you'd see there are counter-arguments that probably at times do counter Paul's arguments, but because he's the one with the revelation and the authority, he kind of stands out above them. But the truth is Jewish Christianity had a lot to say, and the world wasn't coming together the way Paul had promised. So maybe James, hedging his bets, if you will, was doing the wise thing.
The title of the book is of the movie. It's A Polite Bribe. Now, how was this a bribe? I mean, when I think of a bribe, I think of The Godfather saying, I'll make him an offer he can't refuse, or something like that.
Can't refuse.
Or politicians.
Did you see in the movie?
Yes. Yes, in your movie, that's something that comes across, but I'd like you to explain to our listeners, how exactly is this a bribe?
Well, one, I don't know if you remember, but Ben Witherington in the film, and Ben's a great guy, but he actually he does a Godfather impression in the movie. I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. It's really good. No, actually, the phrase itself comes from Gerhard Ludemann, who got it from a lecture by a man named Tom Hall, was doing a lecture. But the polite bribe apparently goes far back to Bultmann and some other scholars. And the idea was, there was also a term for it that the French philosophers came up with called the poison chalice, was another way of describing it. But the idea was that in offering something good, they could also be persuasive in the offering, like someone donating to a cause where the people don't like the person donating the money, but they need the money, but yet. So it's kind of like this awkward kind of, you just do this little thing for me and allow my Gentiles to be part of the overall community, and I will bring the funds to Jerusalem and unify the movement. So it has a persuasive quality. I think it's important to point out, I didn't say the crooked bribe or the underhanded bribe. I'm saying the polite bribe, because it's not without spiritual meaning. I don't hold that point of view that it's all crooked.
Of course.
But some people will.
Paul is not Vito Corleone or anything like that. Now, at the Jerusalem Council...
Paul, actually, it's interesting, but some people would argue I didn't go far enough.
Right. But at the Jerusalem Council, James and Paul and Peter and some spies, allegedly, that's how Paul describes them, that sneaking, they accepted the deal. Now, how come at the end James rejected the offer? Why did he change his mind?
Well, the way I see that, and the scholars saw that, if you use kind of our modern political framework, at least in the U.S., it's that we saw James as kind of a moderate broker. The false apostles were kind of the hard right, and Paul is the left. He's on the liberal left there, and in that circumstance, because he's breaking out from the tradition into a new vision for the community, and James and the right is kind of holding down everything and trying to cut off any changes at all. And James is in the middle, saying, we believe in what Paul's doing, but we need to filter him through this other thing. And so, in a way, James gets to benefit. Don't forget, Paul didn't bribe them. Paul responded to James asking Paul for a collection. It's important to say this because, we can't get into all the nuance, but if you study the nuance, people are saying that Paul agreed to do a collection. That's important. It wasn't Paul suggesting it. So Paul is saying, yeah, I'll do that too if you need me to do that. So maybe it was James who said ultimately they had the original idea. Well, what's the middle point here of meeting? If I go all right here, there's no Christianity in the new sense. If I go all left, I may challenge the roots of Judaism. So maybe the polite bribe was a way to find the middle ground that ultimately developed into the faith.
It seems to me that James didn't keep his word. As simple as that. what's your indictment of the character of James? To me, he seems very moral for doing this.
I think you're cutting out a little bit, but I think you understand. You're saying James seemed like the legitimate follower of
No. What I'm saying
of
is
Jesus?
that he changed his mind, even though after he asked for the collection, when he was finally given the collection, he rejected. Now, that's an immoral thing to do, it seems to me. So how would you indict James' character? I mean, I see it as immoral.
Well, there's no... Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is gray. To me, that's one of the black and white points you can't get around, is that even with a simple timeline, because people would argue, how do you know what the chronology was? But most people, literally most scholars, would agree that the book of, the book of Acts in Acts chapter 21, then you have Romans 15, and then you have the early agreement, which is probably in 49 or so. So most people would believe that the Acts of the Apostles comes before, in terms of the timing of the Second Council meeting, when they have an agreement, and then to the point where Paul is doubting it, and then ultimately Acts 21, that you could pretty much sequence those through to be a devolution of their relationship, because, yes, if James is the middle power broker in 49 AD, why is Paul fearing he'll reject the collection in 58 AD? And then why, like Acts 21, which is either 58 plus maybe 60 AD, he's almost assassinated near the temple where James had the church, the synagogue. So I think it says clearly that their relationship spiraled down and out, and ultimately at the end Paul had no friends, would have not have been considered part of the core movement, and in a way was shunned. I think it's only with the Jewish war does that shift of power go back the other way, and now that the Jewish Christians are gone, Paul's influence in the diaspora with the Gentiles emerges to be the new Christianity.
One of the most provocative things from the film and the book, and I mean I watched the film and I also read the book, is this idea that maybe James was behind Paul's arrest and not kill him because he wasn't killed, but behind the riot that ensured his arrest at the temple in Jerusalem. How guilty was James, according to your view?
Yeah, I was, as a filmmaker, I try and really stand in a place where I can argue for something and feel comfortable about it in front of an audience. And I thought I couldn't completely commit to the idea, and I'll get to it in a second, of James setting Paul up like almost like a plot in advance. But I also couldn't deny some culpability of James because I got to know his power in Jerusalem. I think we think of him again as all these men who are in sackcloth and ashes praying all the time, but James was considered a bishop. He was considered a leader, a big leader, to the point where he was killed himself by another tribal leader as a threat to his people. So, I mean, James is a very powerful figure. And the idea that he could, with that kind of power, lead the Jewish Christian synagogue in Jerusalem, be aware of the comings and goings, and then he has a famous, what they would consider an anti-Jewish leader, a figure coming into town with a collection and coming to him and not be aware of the fact that there would be some serious danger or try and prevent that danger or intercede seems like too much of a stretch. So I landed on the fact that I think James knew something and either couldn't do anything about it or didn't do anything about it, but knew it in his mind. But let me add one other thing. Since I finished the film, from further exploration and from all the questions, the most consistent question I get at a screening or after a book tour or whatever is people say, well, what did you think James did? Don't you think he was? So I had to kind of confront that, and I dug a little deeper and found there are scholars who believe he was part of, what's the word, not a massacre. He's, conspiracy. When you're setting something, yeah, he was part of some conspiracy. Yeah, that ultimately he was waiting and James knew it, and it was just a matter of time to lead him into the right context like that. I didn't land there on the film, but I can understand why some people believe that.
I'm aware that this is indeed the conclusion of many scholars, but I wonder if some people in the media think that this is too sensationalist and maybe would accuse you of promoting this sensationalism to sell more books and sell more tickets for the film, because, I mean, it does sound a bit sensationalist.
Right. No, that's a great question. And I wish, I look back and I say jokingly, if I had been more of a sensationalist, I would have made this film in about 1/10 of the time. And it would have been less of a heartache to try and do it, where I took a very independent, to my own peril, to my own sacrifice, I took a very independent, and I went even across the entire political spectrum of interviews. It took a long time to really find what was the independent Paul that could be common ground to all of these points of view. I would have never done that if I started from a political or a slant just to try and bash Christianity, not to mention being a Christian for 20 years myself, and you saw in the book, the bibliography in the book. So, yeah, I could say that. Now, what I will add is that in the U.S. at least, it is so driven by this bubble of fundamentalism. It's hard to describe if you don't live here and then you travel abroad like I have, where you'll speak to the same type of interest level in the UK, for instance, in the Bible, and they're with you and they're trying to join together the facts and come up with either agreement or disagreement. But in the United States, it's almost as if, especially the fundamentalists and the very conservatives, are hearing this for the first time. Now that fascinates me as a filmmaker because it says, wow, I got to a place where very few have gotten. But from as a point of marketing the film and promoting it, it's been a bit of confusion because you'd say, wow, you would think people who spent this much time looking at a book would not deny so many facts.
Right.
And it's we're still addressing this, and I've been like blacklisted, I think, in certain areas, and not overtly, but I could tell you that I know that certain people just don't want to read this and don't want to know. And I'm merely saying to them, these are your teachers, these are your professors, this is what your textbooks are written from, and I'm just putting it in story form. But there's something about attaching this kind of divine bubble to all things being as they should, and human beings had nothing to do with it, and there's no impact on their thoughts because God steps past their humanity, and it's kind of bizarre and very worrisome and anti-intellectual.
Right. Well, be careful with that because as far as I remember, there was a scholar back in the 80s, I think, that wrote a book arguing that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, and she received some bombing in her mail. A bomb exploded in an open envelope. In America, she received hate mail. But, I mean, this was literally hate mail because there was a bomb inside. No, I'm joking. I don't think that will be the case for you.
I understand. No, and I appreciate that. But the truth is, with what they're doing sometimes is they're arguing theology. Right. What I'm saying is the complement to traditional theology, if you were just blending it with the facts of history and what you can be known in history, these would just complement, from the human perspective, the divine understanding of theology. As a matter of fact, I put him on my site, and maybe I could follow up with you, but the famous conservative Catholic historian Paul Johnson, he in his history of Christianity spends a lot of the opening saying, as a believer and as this, I'm this, but as a historian, I'm going to tell you this. And he goes on to delineate this whole conflict between James and Paul in the same way my film does. And I said, there it is, a historian who knows the difference between theology and history, and here he's willing to put together one without being infected with his personal faith. Now, to me, that's an integrated approach to it. A lot of people are very afraid of doing that.
Yeah, no, and he's not the only Catholic scholar. Raymond Brown also is another one very prominent that's in this list. Robert, thank you very much. Where can we get your book and watch your film? Maybe in some future in Latin America we'll be able to. Tell our listeners where they can see the film and read the book.
Please go to www.apolitebribe.com, and you'll be able to buy the book, buy the film, write your comments. We'll get to them. But I really look forward to keeping this discussion going, and now with a publisher and a distributor, it should start really taking off.
Is there any prospect of reaching Latin America with the book and the film?
I think so. My hope is that I could find a Spanish translator. You know anyone?
Actually, well, maybe I could do the job, but I mean, I've only translated like a couple of books. But we could talk about that in the future.
I just found out today it's going into German and Italian, so we'll see where it goes.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and we'll keep in touch. Take care.
All right. Enjoy.
Okay.
Bye-bye.